and KETC, the St. Louis educational television station, present A Course for Vision. The Religions of Man, with Dr. Houston Smith, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Washington University.
Last week we noted that Hinduism says to its followers, you can have what you want. As long as you want the so-called desires of this world, wealth, fame, pleasure, power, go after these things. There's nothing wrong in doing so at all. The only point is that sooner or later you will come to the realization that these things are not enough. Even when they're translated into the so-called finer things of life, there comes a time in which, in the words of Aldous Huxley, one asks even of Shakespeare, even of Beethoven, is this all? Now, when that time comes, what does Hinduism answer? Is there anything beyond Beethoven? And Hinduism says there is. But what is it? Well, it must be something which satisfies the deepest desires of man. And this brings us once more to the question of what we really want. What do you really want? We answered this on one level last time, but Hinduism says that these things that men think they want are really only means to deeper desires. What do you really want? How do you answer that question when you're not distracted, when you have time to think about it, when you're alone, perhaps at night? Well, Hinduism says that men ultimately want three things. First of all, they want being. We want to exist rather than not to exist. We don't want to die. Ernie Pyle, that great war correspondent, shortly before his death was spending an evening with a group of men just before they went the next day into some action where it was known that 3/4 of them would surely lose their lives. And Ernie Pyle was trying to gather together the feelings, the thoughts, the mood of that room. And I'll never forget the way he put it. He said, these men really weren't afraid to die. No, that wasn't the way to put it at all. But rather he sensed in them a deep underlying reluctance to give up the future. Well, that's true with all of us. We don't want to be dropped out of existence as it moves along. Second, they say, we want to know. We want awareness. People are infinitely curious. They don't like to be in the dark. They don't like to be left out of what's going on. And finally, the third of our deep desires, we want happiness. We want joy, unlimited joy, ideally, which we might call bliss or ecstasy. Well, now, is there anything which answers to these desires? Hinduism adds one point. It says not only do we want being, awareness, and joy, but we want these things to an infinite degree because man's mind can always imagine infinity. And as long as these things are short of infinity, so he can imagine more, he will always want them. Take, for example, being. The span of life has been doubled in our generation. Does that mean we're any more eager to die? No. We want these things, and really, we would like to have them to an infinite degree. Now, is there anything which answers to man's infinite outreach? And Hinduism says, yes, there is. What is it? Well, as we noted last time, it's God. And what is God? Well, being infinite, we can't imagine him in our finite concepts. The mind is equipped to deal with limited things and can't lay hold of infinity. The Hindus dramatize this with the concept neti, which means really not this, not this. What is God? Well, they say you go all around this phenomenal world, this universe that our senses can pick up, and we say of everything in it, not this, he's not this, he's not this. And when you've exhausted the whole world of the senses, then what's left? That is God. But this, after all, isn't adequate. Our minds do need to reach out in the direction of this infinite being. And so in order to do that, they introduce symbols. And one of the profoundest, the most beautiful symbols for God is this symbol Om. As we noted last time, being in the background, awareness symbolized by the rays going out, and this effulgent quality in the middle signifying joy. They call it Om. This much is very close to our Western concepts of God in the great tradition, infinite being, awareness, and joy. But the Hindus add one last quality. They say this infinite being is latent within every individual life. This whole world has that as its soul. That is reality. That art thou. Well, this sounds very good, but we're tempted to say, I don't happen to feel very divine today, nor do I notice this quality conspicuously in my neighbor in the way he acts. The morning newspapers don't declare the divinity of man at our breakfast table. How does this go together? And the Hindus would agree. But what they would add is, what they would say is that this divinity is very deep lying within man. It's obscured, just as a mirror covered with enough soot, enough dust, enough mud can fail completely to reflect the sun. So similarly, that luminous being which is latent within man is covered up by all kinds of distractions, by impurities of thought, by malice, by envy. We have then, the Hindus say, to make a journey from ourselves as we now are to our real selves, which is divine. And that brings us to our topic for this evening. Let me summarize it with a word. We're going to talk tonight about the yogas. Now, this is a very strange word to us. In fact, I find myself smiling in a Western context whenever I turn to this word, because, well, we associate it with the bizarre, the fantastic, the occult, maybe even the fraudulent a little bit, the fakers. I brought along to the studio this evening a symbol of what yoga means to us. Here is a bird. It hit the market, as far as I know, about a year ago. And it has suction cups on the bottom, so it will climb up walls. Well, what is the name of this bird? Here is the cardboard it came wrapped in. This is the yogi bird. And on this, we find the usual things that we associate with yogi. Climbs walls, walks ceilings, completely defies gravity. Yogi bird from eastern India. Well, yogi, strange, different, odd, peculiar. Not entirely. Because if we look at this word, we find a very interesting thing. Actually, it comes from the same root as a word which is very familiar to us, and that word is yoke. Yoga really means union, and in its religious sense, it means a path to union with God. The yogas, then, are paths. They are paths from finite to infinite being. They are paths from the way of desire to a completely different kind of life. They are paths to what lies beyond Beethoven. Now, note that I've been saying yogas. I've been saying paths in the plural, because that's the way they view it. According to their view, men are different, and being different, they start from different places, and therefore the routes which they travel to God will be somewhat different. Specifically, they say, people tend to fall into four classes, four kinds. First of all, some people are very reflective, very intellectual. These are the philosophers. There aren't very many of them around, so we don't have to spend much time on them, but there are some people for whom the mind plays a very important part in their life. When they're intellectually convinced of something, this gives the green light, and their whole lives follow according to their mind's dictates. Now, to these people, Hinduism says, use this mental endowment to bring you closer to God. How does it proceed? Well, specifically, it proceeds through a systematic reasoning, cleaving the acts of discrimination so as to bring man to the realization that he is not basically his body. He is not basically this brittle mind and personality. Those are not him. He is something else, deeper lying. After all, who am I? Am I my body? The biologists tell us that there's nothing in my body now that was here 7 years ago. My mind, my personality change even more rapidly. No, yet I somehow have endured through these changes. That which endures through its manifestations cannot be equated exhaustively with the manifestations. Well, we won't spend more time with this, but just to note that for them, they say to those who are philosophically minded, here are some exercises, here are some reasoning processes which lead you to realize that you basically are not this body, not this personality, but something more than either. Now, there's a second kind of person, and there are more in this class. These are the people who work. They are really immersed in their livelihood. Some of them work because they can't escape from it. More of them work because they really love to work. Now again, Hinduism says to these people, go ahead with your work. Don't try to withdraw and go up to the Himalayas. You would just be frustrated if you couldn't be involved in activity. But use this work as a means of spiritual progress. Turn it to spiritual benefit. And how do you do that? Well, by distinguishing between the work and the results of work. Both things are involved in every act we do. There is the work itself and the results. Now, they say most people have their mind split. Half their mind is on what they're doing, half the mind is on what they hope to get out of it, by way of pay, by way of recognition. Now, this kind of distraction, this kind of centering on the results to me, which will come to my work, immerse us further in this world and in our ignorance about ourselves. Let me give you an example. When I was a student, in my student days, I used to pick up $1 now and then by waiting on tables for dinners. I remember very clearly waiting on a woman's dinner of a woman's club, and as I was pouring that second cup of coffee, you overhear snatches of the conversation. And this woman was saying to the lady next to her, I've worked and I've worked and I've worked on this project. And if I don't get my picture in Sunday's paper, I'm through with it forever. Well, this is the way we work, with one eye on the consequences to us. Very well, but it's not the way, they say, to enlightenment. No, he who does the task dictated by duty, caring nothing for the fruits of action, he is a yogi. In this way, giving our strokes, but letting the chips fall where they may, this is the way in which our work can progressively be turned towards spiritual advantage. Now, there is a third kind of person. This third type is the person who is very emotionally inclined. I hesitate to use that word because emotional has some qualities I don't quite mean. I don't mean over-emotional, but this is the kind of person for whom human relations mean a great deal. They're very affectionate, very loving in their nature, very sensitive people. Often they're great artists, great poets. Now, love is a deep, one of the fundamental qualities in life. We're always reaching out for something to love, and some people, this is the dominant quality in their life. Now, to those people, Hinduism again says, use this resource which is in you, but use it again to spiritual benefit. And the way to do this, the best way, is to focus your love on God, on the infinite, that which is infinitely worthy of love. But it's very difficult to love an abstraction. It's very difficult to love a symbol. And so they say, here is where the incarnations of God are of supreme value. Because when we find God in human life, as occasionally happens in history, then this pulls forth our love, and it's easy to love them. And so they say, keep your mind on God throughout the day, and keep your affections directed upon him. You do this by saying his name over and over during the day. Keep the name of the Lord spinning in the midst of all your activities, while you're washing the dishes, while you're vacuuming the rug. Keep repeating the name of God. Singing of hymns also helps. The saying of prayers and psalms. All this will help to direct the devotion towards him. They go on to add, however, that man is an interesting creature in that his love has many dimensions. And they will say, tap all these directions of your love towards God. Think of him as your father, and this will draw the emotions of a child for his father and for his mother. So the Hindus think of God also in terms of the Divine Mother, tapping our impulses as children and our feelings of dependence. They also say, think of God as your friend. This is another quality of love. Think of him as your lover. This is more remote from us, but we find it too in the mystical tradition of the marriage of the soul to Christ. Think of God also as your master. And here again, in Christian liturgy, we have hymns that say, my master and my friend, all tapping these qualities of love. And as we think of him as our master, we go about doing all our work for him, dedicating it to him as would a servant, devoted servant, dedicating his labors to his beloved master. Finally, they say it's good at times to think of God in the form of a child, because this will tap our impulses as parents. On the surface, we have nothing like this in the West, but I would like to suggest that part of the power of the Christmas story comes from just this fact, that it's the one occasion during the year when Christians deliberately think of God in the form of a little baby. This, then, is the third yoga, the way to God through love. And finally, there's a fourth kind of person. This is a kind of interesting type, basically experimental. He doesn't want to believe anything on faith. He doesn't want to become involved in rituals. And they say, all right, this experimental outreach, too. can be tapped to divine purposes, to carry you towards God. And so we come to the fourth yoga. The yoga, I think the best word I can think of is the yoga of psychophysical exercises. Now, this yoga involves traditionally 8 steps. I'm going to collapse them a little bit for brevity of time, but bring out the main points. The first step is moral living. As a matter of fact, the moral life is the preface to each of these ways. As long as you are not at peace with your neighbor, the distractions, the tensions there will frustrate your further activity. We begin then in this fourth way with moral behavior. Then we go on next to a very interesting point. This involves, you see, they're going to bring the mind to a different state, a different quality of consciousness. But you can't work only with the mind, they say, because the mind is related to the body. And so they say posture. When you're meditating, posture is very important. Otherwise, the body will intrude and will frustrate, distract your thinking. Now, this is where we come to the famous yoga position, and I want to just show you what this is. There's always a little humor involved in this because it's so strange to us. But nevertheless, I think we ought to know what this is. They say the most effective position, which will still the mind, is the so-called yoga, the lotus posture. It doesn't go very well with shoes, which is why I've taken mine off. Actually, it doesn't go very well with trousers either, but we'll forget about that tonight. You put one foot up here in the lap. Then all you have to do is to bring the other foot around like that. The spine must be completely straight. Now they say when you get used to this, the point is that this will put your mind at rest and keep out the bodily distractions better than any other position. Well, it sounds strange, it looks strange, but we mustn't forget that we too work with the body when we're working with the spirit. Our position is different. Our position, by and large, is kneeling, the position of kneeling, but the same principle of mind-body coordination as effective for spiritual purposes is involved. All right? Postures, then, is the second principle. The third principle is that of breathing. The breath has a very intimate quality in life, and again, it has an effect on our mental states, they would say. And so, breathing practice is important. So they engage, as part of their religion, as part of their spiritual development, training in breathing. Some of it is very good sense to us, evenness of breath. But then they also bring in things which are strange to us. You learn to breathe in one nostril and out the other nostril, and a number of very different exercises which in the end sometimes sound very strange. But keep in mind the principle. The principle is that breathing affects the condition of the mind. Now the third point is to bring together the mind in focus by shutting out the senses. And here they try to disconnect the senses from the external stimuli. I know a friend who practiced this. He was from India. He taught on our faculty here for a while, and he said that he actually developed this to the point where a drum could be beating in the room and he would not hear it. Well, there's really nothing so bizarre about this if you practice, because concentration does shut out stimuli. My wife says I'm very good at this step of yoga sometime. When I'm really concentrating on what I'm doing, she calls me to lunch and I don't hear her at all. Withdrawing then of the senses so the mind can be turned inward. And then this is followed by the next 3 steps, really. I'll speak of them as one, of concentration. Bringing the mind to focus on a single point. The mind is eternally restless, they would say. They have a lot of images for this. They say the mind is like a monkey prancing around the cage, never still. But that doesn't do it justice. We have to add that it's like a drunk monkey. But even this doesn't do justice to the restlessness of the mind. We have to say that it's like a drunk monkey that has the St. Vitus dance. But again, even this doesn't do real justice to how restless our mind is. We have to say it's like a drunk monkey that has St. Vitus dance that has been stung by a wasp. And then you get some picture of how restless the mind is. How long can you keep your mind on one point before, first of all, you start thinking not about that, but about thinking about that? Well, 3.5 seconds is the usual span. You, by practice, though, can increase this. You can develop the mind so your will has control over it, so that instead of being like a ping-pong ball which bounces from one thing to another, it's like a lump of dough. You throw it at an object and it sticks there until you, by will, extract it. The flame of a lantern flickers not in a windless place, and that ultimately is what they're trying to get to in this stage of meditation, where it is divorced from all kinds of external distractions. Well, in the end, you see, this leads to an experience which is totally different in kind. It leads to what we in the Western tradition call the mystic experience. But they feel that this can be produced actually by training involving the moral life, involving postures, involving training in breathing, in withdrawing the senses from external objects, and finally in concentrating them on one point until in the end you lose all sense of your separate identity, and what is left, you're plunged. You're plunged into being itself. Well, these are the 4 yogas in briefest compass, the 4 paths to union with God. They're not easy. They're not to be traversed in a day, but in the end, so the Hindus say, in the end, everybody gets there. In order to understand how this can be so, we shall need to bring in several other important Hindu concepts. The idea of reincarnation, the idea of transmigration, the idea of karma, the idea of liberation. This is for next week. But tonight, we have looked at the 4 yogas. I've tried to tell you about them briefly in my own words. Now in closing, let's let the religion itself speak to them. I close with a few lines from Swami Vivekananda's yoga works, followed by one verse from the Mundaka Upanishad. Each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest this divine within. Do this either by work, or by worship, or by psychic control, or by philosophy, by one or more, or all 4. This is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary detail. As flowing rivers go to rest in the ocean and there leave behind them name and form, so likewise man makes his way to the divine, which is beyond the beyond, which is higher than the highest, which transcends the transcendent.
The Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, the St. Louis Educational Television Station and Production Center.
This is NET, National Educational Television.